Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever felt someone's control over you? Like a shadow you could never quite shake, only to realize one day that you can finally see straight through them. That moment is quiet, almost invisible, but it changes everything inside you. The mask cracks, the stories unravel piece by piece, and the power they once held begins to slip away. Not because you fought back tooth and nail, but because you simply stopped giving it your life force. Tonight, I want to take you through that exact journey, the awakening, the loss of illusion, the calm that disrupts, and the freedom that follows right behind it. By the end of our time together, you will see why clarity is far more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. There is a specific moment that does not announce itself with fireworks or sudden certainty. It arrives quietly, almost gently, and because of that, many people completely miss how powerful it truly is. The moment of awakening is not dramatic at all. It is entirely subtle. It is that exact instant when your body understands something deep down before your mind has even fully caught up to it. You stop feeling constantly on edge all the time. You stop rehearsing entire conversations in your head before they even happen. You stop wondering why everything in your daily life feels so heavy and burdensome. And right there in that quiet pause, you realize the problem was never your sensitivity, your expectations, or your deep need for clarity. The real problem was that you were taught to doubt what your own eyes were seeing. For a very long time, doubt feels much safer than the raw truth. Doubt keeps the peace in the room. Doubt keeps the relationship intact on the surface. Doubt convinces you that if you just try harder, explain things better, and love deeper, everything will eventually change for the better. But true awakening begins the exact second you stop negotiating with your own intuition. It is when you finally realize that lingering confusion is never a normal byproduct of love, respect, or genuine connection. It is a loud signal. And once you recognize it simply as that, you can never unsee it. This awakening does not make you angry right at first. Instead, it makes you entirely still. You listen differently to the world around you. You start noticing consistent patterns instead of isolated incidents. Words completely stop mattering as much as actual behavior does. A frequent apology stops sounding like true healing and starts sounding like a calculated strategy. You begin to trust that quiet voice inside you that has been whispering all along, even back when it was ignored, minimized, or completely drowned out. What makes this particular moment so powerful is that it permanently returns authority back to where it belongs, which is you. You no longer need outside permission to feel unsettled. You no longer need mountains of evidence to justify your discomfort. You simply know the truth. And that deep knowing is grounding, steady, and completely irreversible. From that point onward, you are no longer searching for validation outside of yourself. You have officially crossed a line from just surviving in uncertainty to standing firmly in truth. And once you stand right there, everything that once depended entirely on your self-doubt begins to unravel at the seams. And once that knowing settles deep into your bones, something else begins to happen right alongside it. Something just as quiet and just as irreversible. The grand illusion starts to fall apart piece by piece, not all at once in some grand, dramatic reveal, but through small, undeniable cracks in the facade. You suddenly realize that what once felt overwhelmingly powerful was actually carefully staged the entire time. The confidence you deeply admired was entirely rehearsed. The certainty you trusted so much depended entirely on your own ongoing uncertainty to exist at all. And the exact moment you stopped doubting yourself, that fragile spell weakened instantly. Control of that nature simply cannot survive in clear air. It requires a thick fog to operate. It needs constant second-guessing, deep emotional exhaustion, and the endless back and forth of wondering if maybe it is all your fault. When that fog lifts even just a tiny bit, the entire structure begins to wobble precariously. You start noticing how important conversations loop endlessly instead of ever resolving. How grand promises are nothing more than recycled explanations. How accountability is always redirected, delayed, or diluted until it disappears. What used to feel complex and mysterious now feels entirely repetitive, predictable, and empty. This is the true loss of illusion. It is not just seeing the truth about them, but seeing the truth about the entire dynamic itself. You finally understand that the connection was never truly mutual in the way you always believed it was. It was built entirely on an imbalance, with you carrying all the heavy emotional weight while they carried the carefully managed narrative. And the moment you stop participating in that unfair imbalance, the illusion can no longer hold its shape together. What is truly unsettling is how remarkably ordinary it suddenly looks without your belief actively feeding it. The grand performance completely loses its power over you. The words they use do not land the same way anymore. The forced intensity now feels artificial. Even their manipulation starts to feel almost transparent, much like watching a play after you have already read the entire script. You are no longer trapped inside the confusion. You are standing outside of it, observing it clearly. And that is precisely when the shift becomes entirely real. Not because they suddenly change their ways, but because you have changed yours. You are no longer searching for hidden meaning in their difficult behavior. You simply see it for exactly what it is. The illusion dissolves not through a loud confrontation, but purely through quiet awareness. And absolute awareness is the one thing that control can never survive against. And as that heavy illusion fades away, something even more unexpected begins to take place in your environment. The room does not get louder at all. In fact, it gets much quieter. The arguments do not escalate into shouting matches. They simply thin out and fade away. The overwhelming emotional chaos that once filled every single corner of your mind starts losing its tight grip on you. Not because anything was magically resolved, but simply because your precious energy is no longer being poured into it. This is the exact place where the real shift finally happens. Power does not disappear in a loud clash of wills. It dissolves entirely in the absence of attention. For such a long time, your intense focus was the primary fuel keeping the fire burning. Every single explanation, every emotional reaction, and every desperate attempt to be understood kept the toxic dynamic alive and well. You did not realize it back then because you were acting entirely in good faith, genuinely believing that a real connection required endless effort. But once true clarity finally arrives, that effort becomes highly selective. You stop overextending yourself for people who give nothing back. You stop chasing a sense of closure that never arrives. And in that sudden withdrawal of energy, something very destabilizing occurs on the other side. The entire energy of the room changes. You are no longer feeding the vicious cycle with urgency or raw emotion. Your responses become much slower, much simpler, and sometimes completely non-existent, not out of any cruelty, but strictly out of self-preservation. And that calm, steady neutrality does something truly profound. It removes their entire stage. Without your reactions to play off of, there is no performance left to give. Without your active engagement, there is no longer a center for them to orbit around. This is why the entire shift feels so remarkably quiet. There is no big announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just a gradual and peaceful detachment that speaks much louder than any argument ever could. You are not pulling away out of spite or anger. You are stepping back purely in crystal clear clarity. And true clarity does not argue with nonsense. It simply observes. What is so powerful about this phase is that you are not even trying to forcefully take power back from them. You are simply reclaiming your own energy. And when your personal energy is fully reclaimed, control has nowhere left to root itself. It naturally begins to slip away. You might not see it happening immediately on the surface, but they can definitely feel it. They feel the total absence, the undeniable difference, and the sudden loss of access to you. Because what once gave them all their leverage was your heavy emotional investment in them. And now that valuable investment is being completely redirected toward your own inner peace, toward trusting yourself, and toward your own well-being. And in that powerful redirection, the balance quietly and unmistakably shifts forever. And when that balance finally shifts, something hidden begins to surface from beneath the surface. Without your restless energy propping up the entire dynamic, the carefully crafted image they work so hard to maintain starts to crack wide open. What steps forward to take its place is not strength. It is pure fear, raw, completely unmasked, and often deeply unexpected. Because their control was never actually about genuine confidence. It was always just about avoiding personal vulnerability at all costs. When your reactions finally fade away and your attention completely withdraws, you are no longer reflecting back the flattering version of themselves that they desperately need to believe in. And that sudden absence is profoundly unsettling to them. Beneath their charming exterior, their outward certainty, and their carefully curated persona, there has always been a deeply fragile core, one that entirely depends on constant external validation just to feel real. Your crystal clarity directly threatens that fragile illusion. Not because you are actively attacking it, but simply because you are no longer reinforcing it for them. This is precisely where their behavior might start to feel confusing to you all over again, but in a completely different way. You might suddenly notice strange flashes of deep insecurity right where arrogant dominance once lived. You might see dramatic overreactions to the smallest, most reasonable boundaries. You might witness emotional volatility that feels entirely disproportionate to the situation at hand. You will see desperate attempts to provoke any kind of response from you, not out of actual power, but purely out of sheer desperation. These are never signs of control tightening its grip. They are unmistakable signs of it completely unraveling at the seams. Genuine fear does not always look like fear on the outside. Sometimes it wears a loud mask of manufactured anger. Sometimes it hides cleverly behind self-righteousness or sudden, heavy self-pity. But at its absolute core, it is simply the terror of being completely unseen, or even worse, of being seen far too clearly for who they are. Because when the mask finally slips off, what remains is the harsh truth that they have spent their entire lifetime running away from. And this is the part of the journey that can truly test your resolve. When you finally recognize the deep fear hiding beneath a difficult behavior, natural empathy may rise up inside you. You might suddenly feel a strong urge to soften your stance, to reassure them, and to step right back into the familiar role that once kept a temporary peace. But true awareness asks something completely different of you at this stage. It asks you to hold genuine compassion without resorting to self-sacrifice. Seeing their fear does not mean that you are suddenly responsible for fixing it. Understanding their underlying insecurity does not mean you have to carry it on your shoulders. The exact moment you stop confusing healthy empathy with misplaced personal responsibility is the moment you protect the hard-earned clarity you fought so hard to reach. Because their internal fear is simply not your burden to soothe or cure. And the more you stay firmly grounded in that fundamental truth, the more the entire illusion of control continues to fall completely away, exposing whatever was always hiding underneath. And once you completely stop taking responsibility for their irrational fear, another exhausting mechanism quietly shuts down for good. The constant, dizzying rewriting of reality no longer works on you anymore. The looping questions that once sent you spiraling into doubt, like whether you imagined things, whether you were overreacting, or whether you were secretly the problem all along, finally lose their power to confuse your mind. Begin to lose their grip completely. Not because they stop trying to manipulate you, but because their words no longer find any soft place to land. Gaslighting at its very core requires blind belief to survive. And that belief needs oxygen, just like a fire. When you were unsure of yourself and full of doubt, their version of events could easily slip right into the cracks of your mind. You would replay past conversations over and over, search frantically for the right tone to use, and wonder how things went so wrong so quickly. But true clarity has completely changed the environment around you. You remember exactly what was said. You trust how it felt in your body. And when your internal reality becomes solid as rock, distortion simply cannot take hold anymore. What is so striking is how obvious the manipulation becomes. Statements clearly contradict themselves. Denials arrive far too fast to be genuine. Apologies always circle right back around to blaming you. You finally notice how all that confusion was never accidental. It was entirely strategic, designed specifically to keep you off balance, to make you question your footing just enough so that you would reach out to them as the sole authority on what is real. But that fake authority dissolves the exact moment you stop handing it over to them. And so the gaslighting starts to suffocate from a lack of air. You do not argue back against it anymore. You do not defend your memory or try desperately to prove your point. You simply disengage from the useless debate entirely. Not because you have lost your voice, but because you have finally found it. True silence in this kind of space is never weakness. It is pure discernment. This shift can be deeply unsettling for them to witness. When manipulation stops working on you, it almost always escalates before it finally collapses. The stories become far more dramatic and extreme. The accusations become much more urgent. The tone grows noticeably sharper. But beneath all of that noise is the exact same panic. You are simply no longer reachable through confusion. And that right there is the ultimate turning point. When your reality belongs to you again, control has zero leverage left to use. You are no longer living inside their distorted version of the world. You are standing firmly in your own light. And once that happens, the false narrative they relied on for so long to stay powerful begins to fall apart word by word, lie by lie, until there is nothing left to sustain it. And when that narrative loses its grip, something remarkable happens in the quiet space you now occupy. You become calm in ways that would have once felt completely impossible, not numb, not detached from reality, just wonderfully steady. And that steadiness, more than any argument or accusation ever could, becomes deeply unsettling to someone who feeds exclusively on your emotional reaction. Because when chaos no longer echoes back to them, it exposes how much unnecessary noise was always required to feel in control. Your calm is never passive. It is deeply intentional. It is the calm that comes from no longer needing anyone else to believe in you in order to believe in yourself. Conversations that once would have easily pulled you into heavy emotional spirals now end much sooner, much softer, and sometimes completely without resolution. And that is perfectly okay. You are no longer trying to win understanding from someone who is deeply invested in misunderstanding you. And that one shift changes everything. Neutrality becomes your quiet power. You are not acting cold. You are simply clear. You listen without absorbing their poison. You respond without over-explaining yourself. And in doing so, you remove the invisible emotional hooks that once kept you tightly tethered to them. This is deeply disruptive to someone who relies on high intensity to maintain control. Without your reactions, your tears, your anger, and your urgency, the toxic dynamic slowly starves to death. You may notice ongoing attempts to provoke you with subtle digs, reopened arguments, and comments specifically designed to test whether you are still reachable. And when those desperate attempts meet your calm instead of your chaos, something inside them fractures because they are no longer steering the emotional weather. You are. What is important to remember here is that your calm is never performative. It is not about trying to look strong on the outside. It is about being truly anchored on the inside. You are no longer negotiating your self-worth in the middle of exhausting conversations. You are no longer explaining your boundaries as if they require their official approval. You simply exist peacefully inside of them. And that presence, steady, grounded, and unreactive, speaks much louder than any confrontation ever could. It says without uttering a single word that you are no longer available for this game. And in that exact moment, control does not just weaken, it becomes entirely obsolete. Because power rooted entirely in reaction cannot possibly survive in the presence of true peace. And when peace finally replaces reaction, the dynamic reaches a critical breaking point. The deep calm you carry does not go unnoticed by them. It is felt as a profound loss, a loss of access, a loss of influence, and a loss of the familiar levers that once easily moved you. And in that vast absence, what often follows is a sudden surge of behavior that feels much louder, sharper, and more extreme than before. This is not strength returning to them. This is control desperately grasping at its final threads. You may see it in the form of exaggerated charm, as if love and warmth could simply be turned on like an electric switch. Sudden promises appear out of nowhere. Self-awareness seems to arrive overnight like magic. Or the exact opposite surface behavior may appear. Anger where confidence once lived. Accusations where normal conversation used to be. Sometimes it is heavy victimhood, featuring a sudden narrative where they are misunderstood, abandoned, or unfairly treated. Each version has the exact same purpose, which is to pull you back into active engagement. This frantic scramble can feel disorienting if you do not recognize it for what it truly is. Old patterns are simply being recycled with much more urgency because the old manipulation methods no longer work. Your calm has completely removed the predictability they relied on. And unpredictability is terrifying to someone who needs absolute control to feel safe. What is important here is your personal restraint, not emotional withdrawal out of bitterness, but conscious non-participation. You do not rush to correct their false story. You do not chase after an apology that will never come. You do not defend yourself against accusations that were only designed to provoke you. You stay firmly rooted in what you already know to be true. The truth never needs reinforcement when it is already solid. This phase frequently tests your resolve. The intense pressure can awaken old habits inside you, like the urge to soothe, to clarify, and to restore false balance. But any balance that costs you your soul is not balance at all. Every single time you resist being pulled back into the vicious cycle, the scramble loses its momentum because control can never be forced where consent has quietly been withdrawn. And as you remain steady through all of their escalation, something irreversible happens. Their tactics lose their effect completely. Urgency burns itself out, and what once felt overpowering begins to reveal itself as fragile, reactive, and entirely unsustainable, unable to survive without our active participation. And when that urgency finally burns itself out for good, you arrive at a place that once felt impossible to stand in without feeling overwhelming guilt. You begin to hold your boundaries firmly, not defensively, and not angrily, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty. There is no longer any need to justify them or soften them so they are easier for someone else to accept. They are no longer mere reactions to bad behavior. They are pure expressions of self-respect. This is the exact spot where many people completely misunderstand boundaries. They mistakenly think boundaries are weapons, ultimatums, or walls meant to punish others. But what you are learning now is that boundaries are simply clarity in motion. They are the completely natural result of knowing where you end and where someone else begins. And once you stop arguing for your limits, they become steady instead of negotiable. You might notice how deeply uncomfortable this makes the other person. Boundaries remove ambiguity, and ambiguity is the exact place where control once thrived. When your yes is crystal clear and your no is final, there is simply no room for manipulation to slip through the cracks. You are not threatening distance just to be cruel. You are choosing deep alignment with your own values, your own peace, and your own truth. What is powerful about this phase is that you are no longer trying to teach someone else how to treat you. You are showing yourself how to properly honor you, and that shift changes the entire emotional math of your life. You stop measuring your personal worth by how well you manage someone else's difficult reactions. You stop shrinking your daily needs just to avoid a pointless conflict. You stop sacrificing your clarity just for temporary comfort. Boundaries do not demand understanding from anyone else. They only require respect. And if that respect is not offered to you, the boundary still stands tall. That is the ultimate freedom found within it. You are no longer waiting around for permission to protect your own energy. You simply do it. And in doing so, you reclaim massive amounts of space. Space to breathe deeply, to think clearly, and to exist without constant tension. The surrounding chaos does not magically disappear overnight, but it completely loses its grip on your spirit. Because control can never survive in a place where self-respect is consistently practiced. And with each healthy boundary you hold, you reinforce a brand new truth. Your inner peace is never something to be negotiated away. It is something sacred to be preserved. And even as that peace begins to take solid shape, there is a quiet ache that often walks right alongside it. Because true clarity does not just free you, it also asks you to grieve properly. You grieve the heavy hope you carried for so long, the vast potential you protected, and the fragile version of the relationship you kept artificially alive with endless effort and deep empathy. Holding firm boundaries can feel quite lonely at first because you are finally choosing not to abandon yourself just to keep someone else comfortable.